Good morning, commissioners and members of the public. The Commission is holding this as the third and last webinar of a series on measuring transportation impacts. The Commission recognizes that there are several modeling tools used during project development. At our first webinar, we learned about the use of travel demand models when putting together long-range regional transportation plans. At our second webinar, we focused on project-level transportation and air quality impact analyses during the environmental process. At this webinar, we will hear about performance metrics for SB1 funding applications and discussing project benefits more broadly. I will now turn to Justin to give meeting instructions. Justin, take it away.
Great, thank you, Chair Grisby. Welcome, everyone, to the Measuring Transportation Impacts webinar number 3. The CTC exists to make transportation planning, funding, and policy more understandable and accountable. Our workshops and webinars take place so that commissioners and staff can hear directly from our stakeholders around California. We are pleased to offer this virtual webinar to allow our stakeholders the opportunity to participate no matter where you are. The webinar agenda is located on our website at www.catc.ca.gov. Any document the CTC creates can be translated into any language you need. Simply email us at ctc@catc.ca.gov, and we will have them returned to you as quickly as possible. Live closed captioning is available for this webinar. Please select the Show Captions tab at the bottom of the screen. There are a number of language options available there to choose from. American Sign Language translation is being provided on this webinar for this meeting. You should see the translators on the screen. For all our webinars, we encourage interaction with our stakeholders. There will be opportunity for questions and comments at the end of this webinar. For those attending via Zoom, you should see the webinar control panel likely located on the bottom of your screen. There you will find the Raise Hand and Q&A tabs. We encourage you to use the Raise Hand feature as soon as we reach the public comment item to give the system time to acknowledge you. Commission staff will let you know when it's your turn to make your comment. Alternately, you may use the Q&A tab to submit your comment or question. Commission staff will read that on your behalf. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link or phone number to access this webinar. These should not be shared with other participants, as this can create confusion for staff when making comments. Please do your best to be concise, and please make sure that your comments add new information. If you agree with the comments of a previous speaker, simply make that statement. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Justin. With that, we will turn to presentations from Matthew Yoscott, Deputy Director of Senate Bill 1 Programming at the Commission. We will hear from Hannah Walter, Deputy Division Chief at the Caltrans Division of Transportation Planning, and Mike Wallace, Forecasting Practice Leader at Fairs and Peers. Then we will open it up to public and commissioner comments. First, we will hear from Matthew Yoscott. Take it away, Matthew.
Yes, thank you, Chair Grisby, and good morning, commissioners and attendees. Yes, I will be covering the first presentation for this morning's webinar, and my portion is ultimately to frame why the performance metrics are important to the SB1 programs from a commission perspective. And I know that it will flow into Hannah's presentation from Caltrans and then Mike's presentation from the practitioner's perspective as a consultant. So we can move on to the first slide. And I'll reintroduce myself. And I am Matthew Yoscott. I am the Deputy Director for SB1 programs. I've been with the Commission for a little over 7 years, and I've been working on the SB1 programs that entire time. So I can say anecdotally that the SB1 programs have evolved quite a bit since cycle 1. We now find ourselves upon nearly adopting Cycle 4 program of projects at our June Commission meeting. And I'll describe a little bit about the performance metrics and what they are and how far they've come. So we can move on to the next slide. So just a quick overview of what I plan to cover. I will give a very brief overview of SB1 and the 3 competitive SB1 programs. Then I'll describe why the Commission asks for performance metrics within the SB1 programs. I will give a very brief overview of what the SB1 performance metrics are. And we do have both quantitative as well as qualitative performance metrics. And then lastly, I will provide an overview of the SB1 Performance Metrics Guidebook, which is kind of a guiding tool that the Commission and Caltrans partnered on developing, which has now become a resource for our potential applicants and members of the public, actually dating back to the 3rd cycle of the SB1 programs. Next slide, please. So Senate Bill 1, and I'm sure most of you are aware, was adopted in 2017. And I think it's important to refer to it as the name that it was referred to as the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017. I don't need to describe the funding that came with SB1. I know that it was the first ongoing source of transportation revenue and funding for projects that the state had experienced in some time, actually dating back to Prop 1B. But I do want to emphasize that the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017 required the Commission to hold revenues and funding that we program to projects more accountable to the public. And I think that's very important to emphasize when we're discussing performance metrics this morning. The 3 programs in the SB1 suite of programs are the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, which is the Commission's freight focus program, and local agencies, Caltrans, and regional agencies are eligible to apply to this program. This program is funded both with diesel fuel excise tax revenue collected in the state of California, as well as federal diesel excise tax revenue that comes into the program through the National Highway Freight Program. The second competitive SB1 program is the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. And this program is intended to fund heavily congested corridors with multimodal options that allow travelers to opt out of congestion. So larger RTPAs, or I should say regional transportation planning agencies, metropolitan planning organizations, and Caltrans are eligible to apply to this program. And ultimately, this program is intended to achieve a balance of transportation improvements that considers environmental and community access improvements, which reduce congestion throughout the state. And lastly, the 3rd competitive SB1 program is the Local Partnership Program. And this is a program that is geared towards counties, cities, transportation districts, and regional transportation agencies that have voter-approved fees or taxes that are dedicated solely to transportation improvements. We also allow agencies that have imposed fees that are solely dedicated to transportation improvements to compete in this program as well. But the reason that I want to highlight the 3 programs are that we offer transportation funding mechanisms to aid public agencies of all sizes. We have some very small cities that can compete in each of these programs in the far north coast. We also have some very large organizations, such as the state's MPOs like SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, or the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And I think it's important to emphasize that because we have understood that over time, when agencies of different sizes are competing for the same funding streams, that sometimes they don't have access to the same tools or the same modeling techniques or even the staff resources to provide information that we might be asking for in our programs. And so it's important to emphasize that that is the primary reason why the commission endeavored on developing the performance metrics guidebook, which was meant to provide kind of a one-stop shop for different tools or modeling methods to calculate each of the performance metrics that the SB1 programs require. Next slide, please. So why does the commission ask for performance metrics in the SB1 programs? And when we rolled this out, that was a question I was asked quite a bit. And I'm hopeful that this slide can cover some of our bases there. So I do want to define that a performance metric is a quantifiable or qualitative outcome or benefit of a transportation project. And it's important to describe that because in a lot of sense, I know we've had practitioners that will quantify, for instance, if it's going to be a local road project, maybe the mileage of new pavement that will be delivered or the feet of bike lane that would be delivered. And performance metrics go a little bit beyond that. So the commission gathers performance metrics in order to provide us with project details that reflect how projects are meeting the statutory program objectives and goals. Among these goals and objectives are cleaner air quality, quicker or faster travel time, higher volume of goods movement, and the next slide will kind of cover a better example of what they are. I think we lost the PowerPoint. But I can keep talking because I have it pulled up. So I will keep talking while the team pulls it back together. Performance metrics provide important project details and demonstrate real-world benefits of a project beyond, as I described, what we would consider the infrastructural outputs, which would be the actual pavement or the striping, think tangible transportation assets. Performance metrics give us a glimpse of how these projects are actually impacting the traveler in a real world sense. And we're back up. Okay. Lastly, performance metrics provide the commission with critical project information that we do consider in our project evaluations, and it gives us a sense of how we can compare projects to one another. So as you can imagine, when we have projects that are delivering different modes of improvements, which would be, for instance, maybe a transit project that's building a transit station or adding light zero emission vehicles to the transportation system. When we collect performance metrics, it gives us another way of comparing those projects to one another. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to cover this slide in too much detail because I don't want to step on Hannah Walters' toes. I know she's going to cover it, but I did want to describe briefly the difference between the quantitative performance metrics that we ask for in the SB1 programs versus the qualitative performance metrics that we also ask for. The quantitative metrics you can see on the left side of your screen, a couple that I can call out: travel time savings, safety improvements, air quality improvements, jobs created, benefit cost ratio. We do require vehicle miles traveled metrics in our Solutions for Congested Corridors program and local partnership program. But these are the quantifiable metrics that we understand applicants will use tools or methodologies to quantify how they expect their project to deliver improvements over time. The qualitative performance metrics that we require are instances like community engagement and how projects are promoting equitable outcomes throughout their communities. And so the performance metrics guidebook doesn't talk specifically about the qualitative metrics that you see on this slide. However, each of the SB1 program guidelines do describe what those qualitative requirements are. For instance, accessibility would be whether or not projects are providing access to the system for, it could be elderly citizens or persons with disabilities, ensuring that they can gain access to the closest transit stop accessibly. So those are considerations that are a little more qualitative, but the SB1 programs do require them. And you see efficient land use on there. That is also a criteria that a couple of the SB1 programs require, and we partner with our sister agency at the Department of Housing and Community Development to flesh out how projects are promoting efficient land use. Next slide, please. So lastly, I will talk a little bit about the Performance Metrics Guidebook itself. And I want to describe that this was not something that we had available to applicants in the first two cycles. This was the SB1 cycles, I should say. This was something that the Commission and Caltrans led a very large multi-agency team of transportation planners, transportation data specialists, and transportation policy staff over the course of roughly 7 months back in 2021 to actually develop this performance metrics guidebook. The guidebook was finalized in January 2022 and automatically became integrated into the SB1 program guidelines. So it is a resource that is currently available on the Commission's SB1 website. It is quite lengthy. It's about 130 or 140 pages long. But we do continue to utilize this document and refer to it in the SB1 programs dating back to SB1 cycle 3, and we have continued utilizing it in our 4th cycle of SB1 programs. And then briefly, I will talk about what's in the guidebook. So the guidebook itself is intended to be used as a guiding reference for a location where you can find commonly used or free tools and methodologies for calculating performance metrics. So as I described, we had the multi-agency and public agency partner working group. These would be like best practices in the transportation planning world for how to calculate a specific metric. And we put kind of step-by-step how to recreate those methodologies within the guidebook itself. While performance metrics are required in the SB1 programs, the guidebook and the Commission do not require use of a single tool or methodology for calculating any given metric. And that's important to note. You will see, if you refer to the guidebook, you will see different methodologies for the same metric. And we also understand a lot of our partners have their own mechanisms or methodologies for calculating the same metric. And all that we ask is if you choose a specific methodology or tool, that you qualify why that is the best fit for your circumstance or situation. I do want to emphasize that projects that impact the state highway system, so think of anything where Caltrans is the owner and operator, those projects must align to Caltrans requirements. And I know we'll have Hannah, but we can, if anybody has any questions on what that entails, I can say we do require that projects that are either on the state highway system or have a direct impact to the state highway system right away, those projects must follow what Caltrans requires. And lastly, I'll just give an example of one of the models that you can find in the guidebook, the Caltrans benefit cost model, which is commonly referred to as the CalBC model, is an example of a tool that is featured in the guidebook. It's described in the SB1 program guidelines. And this tool can be used to calculate several different performance metrics. And I know Hannah will cover that in a little more detail during her presentation. So I believe that wraps up the framing that I was hoping to do from the SB1 perspective at the commission. And I also understand we will be taking questions or comments following the conclusion of all three presentations. So with that, Justin and Cherry, I will turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Matthew. Next up, we will hear from Hannah Walter.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is Hannah Walter. I work in the Division of Transportation Planning at Caltrans, and I'll go over the SB1 performance metrics and how the CalBC model supports those. And I've had a unique perspective because in my prior job, I worked with Caltrans from the commission side on developing the performance metrics guidebook. And in my current role, the CalBC model is in my area, part of the area I have oversight of. So I've looked at the information from different angles. So hopefully I can help explain it clearly today. Next slide, please. You can keep going. So I wanted to show you this slide to help you visualize where this presentation fits with the other webinars you've seen. You talked about projects in regional transportation plans and those travel demand models. And this presentation is really looking at how do projects perform? How does an individual project perform? What are the benefits of that project? And then I believe you've also looked at some of the CEQA requirements and the air quality conformity requirements as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so for SB1 programs, Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, and Local Partnership Program Competitive, these are the performance metrics that are quantitative and are required for all three of those programs. And I'm just going to go through them at a high level with you. So for travel time reliability, what that's looking at is it's looking at if you think about the worst 1 or 2 days of traffic a month on a specific segment, how bad is that delay associated with those one-off events? That's what travel time reliability is trying to measure. It's a federal metric. There's a federal formula for it. But in the guidebook, we also explain to applicants how to calculate travel time reliability on a per project by project basis. So it looks at a specific segment of road, and the difference between travel time reliability and travel time savings, which I'll talk about next, is that travel time reliability is really looking at how that piece of road compares to all the other roads in California in terms of how much delay there is associated with one-off disruptions. That's what travel time reliability is measuring. For travel time savings, you're looking at how much delay each person driving is experiencing. So that's travel time reliability. There's travel time reliability for passenger vehicles and travel time reliability for trucks. So those are very similar, but slightly different formulas. Then for travel time savings, you're looking at the travel time experienced by individuals in cars. Those are person trips. And then you're looking at travel time experienced by just a car. So in the first one, you're counting the people in the car. And in the second one, you're just counting the car or the truck. The first one, the person trips is, or person hours of travel time saved is the official title, is required for all three programs. The vehicle hours of travel delay or truck hours of travel delay, that is for Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. But travel time savings is looking at not just the amount of time that a project could save, but the amount of money that you could save. So there's an inherent understanding that time equals money. And so it's looking at both the cost that you're saving from traveling faster and the time you're saving by traveling faster. And for all of these metrics, what applicants are asked to report for each project is what is the number without the project and what is the number with the project and what is that change. So for travel time savings, for example, you're looking at what is the person hours of travel time saved on that segment without the project, or I'm sorry, what is the travel time on that segment without the project and what is the travel time on that segment with the project. And then when you subtract those, the without the project from the with project, you get the time saved and the money saved. So that's, you're essentially measuring what change the project is going to make. But that's travel time savings. Then the safety metric looks at, it's actually 4 different numbers. 2 of them are percents and 2 of them are numbers. But it's looking at on the project segment, how many accidents that are serious injuries and how many accidents that are fatalities have been occurring on that segment, and then how many are expected to occur with the project. And it's looking at how the project might prevent crashes. So it looks at the number of serious injuries and the number of fatalities, and then it looks at the rate of serious injuries and the rate of fatalities. So it's really just taking the same information and looking at it as a number and as a percent. But it's measuring how many accidents you think the project will reduce on that segment. And that's safety. And then air quality is taking it's looking at the emissions in tons per year without the project on that segment and with the project. Emissions is a little complicated because it depends on the speed that the cars are traveling, and it also is making assumptions about the emissions that are related to transportation versus all the other sources on that segment of road that could be causing emissions. But the way that I'll talk about how the CalBC model calculates the emissions in a separate slide, but air quality is looking at the reduction in emissions that could occur because of a project in a specific area, in the project area. And then jobs created is looking at the number of jobs that have been created by a project. Right now, we're using a simple multiplier. It's a federal multiplier that is associated with project costs. So essentially, if you look at project costs as money that is being input into a particular economy, then how many jobs is that likely to create? There's been a lot of studies about that, and so they developed a multiplier for it. It's an economic indicator, so that's jobs created. And then the benefit cost ratio is taking, if you monetize all the benefits, so there's a monetary value associated with travel time savings, with preventing crashes, and with reducing emissions. All of those benefits can be monetized. So if you look at the cost of the project and then the benefit of the project in terms of a value, in terms of money, then you just divide the total benefits by the total costs. And the resulting ratio that you get is called the benefit cost ratio. Generally, any benefit cost ratio over 1 is basically saying that there are more monetary benefits for doing the project than there are costs of the project. In other words, the project is worthwhile. So if you see a benefit cost ratio less than 1, it's questionable whether that project is worth it from an economic perspective. If you see a benefit cost ratio greater than 1, then that means there's a monetary benefit for doing that project. That's the benefit cost ratio. So that's an overview of the metrics that are required for all of the 3 programs. And then next slide, please. So here's some metrics that are only required for some. So vehicle miles traveled, that's only required for solutions for congested corridors and local partnership competitive. That's because vehicle miles traveled is not a, it's not an indicator in the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, because goods movement doesn't act the same way, doesn't respond to demand the same way as a passenger vehicle. Truck VMT is also not part of the CEQA calculation, which you probably talked about in a previous webinar. So the vehicle miles traveled is just for solutions and for local partnership. But at a high level, vehicle miles traveled is just looking at the number of cars and the length of the road at its most basic level. That's what it's doing. But the calculation around how much demand may be induced by increasing capacity and such, that is supposed to be included in this metric. So what the guidebook says about induced demand for the vehicle miles traveled metric is that you need to include the induced demand in the with project number. So it's part of this calculation for SB1. And then for change in truck and rail volume, that's a metric that's specific to the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, because the goal of that program is to improve goods movement. So they're trying to look at the change in the volume of trucks or rail with or without the project. Velocity is just a kind of another way of looking at travel time savings, and it's speed, essentially, speed of a vehicle's moving through a specific segment. That's only for a Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. And then level of transit delay, it could be for any of the projects in any of the 3 programs, but it's specific to transit, and that's using the GTFS information that the Data and Digital Services Division in Caltrans has put together a program for. And so it's essentially, if you have a GPS tracking device on a bus, you can look at how on time, on average, are the buses getting to the stop that's in that area, and would the project improve that performance? So that's what that's measuring. You can't measure that for everything, only if the transit agency in that area has set that data up and is kind of like a part of that program. Then you can measure it. Otherwise, you don't have the data for it. So that's why that metric is not required if there's no data available. And that's it. Those are the SB1 metrics that are quantitative, the ones required for all programs and the ones only required for some programs. Next slide, please. So the CalBC model means the California Benefit Cost Model. It's actually it's required for federally funded projects to have a California Benefit Cost Ratio, which is ultimately what the CalBC model was designed to produce. But it can be used as, because it does a lot of calculations automatically, it can also be used to calculate some of the required SB1 performance metrics. So the SB1 performance metrics that you can use based on that you could get from the CalBC model are travel time savings, safety, vehicle miles traveled, air quality, the benefit cost ratio, and velocity. And for VMT, it's assuming that you're capturing induced demand before you before you use the model, because the with project volume information has to be put as an input into the model. So you have to have a different tool to actually calculate the induced demand, but you can get a VMT with and without project in the CalBC model. Okay, that's that slide. Next slide, please. And so a little bit more about the CalBC model. It's an economic analysis tool. It's an economic model. There's actually different versions. The sketch model is the easiest and most commonly used, but there's different versions of the CalBC model for different kinds of projects. There's one specific to freight, for example. It's designed to capture the benefit cost ratio. It's free, and that's really good because a lot of the tools out there that people would have to use to calculate some of this otherwise are not free. It's publicly available online. Anybody can access it. The regional agencies, the districts, and the consultants all use it, and they're all familiar with it. So that is one benefit that it has. And then, as we've discussed, you can pull some SB1 performance metrics information from the tool. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to give you a high-level overview of the model without going into too much detail, but essentially the way the model works is you could think about it as a 3-step process. It's right now, the tool itself is in Excel. So it's a spreadsheet model with multiple tabs. The user goes and puts inputs into the first tab, and then that information runs through a set of formulas, and then it spits out the outputs. And in this slide, the example I'm using is the emissions. So in that top print screen, you can see that it takes the vehicles and it looks at the speed that they're traveling. And then based on that, it's looking at those emissions rates for each of the different types of emissions. And it's multiplying those emissions rates by the speed and the number of vehicles. And that's how it's getting to the emissions. So you look at that with the project and without the project, and the difference is the savings. And then those savings translate to costs. So the state is broken up into the South, and then there's 3 different areas essentially. And they have different health costs associated with the different rates. And so then it looks at how much money you're actually saving by reducing emissions. So those are the calculations the model is doing. And at the end, it will spit out a result that looks at, for emissions, it will show you the reduction in the actual emissions themselves, and then the cost savings associated with that, both of those things. So you put in the inputs, it does the formulas, and it gives you the final outputs. Next slide, please. This is just another look at, this is actually the travel time savings tab. And what I wanted to point out here is the years. So it's summarizing on those top 2 rows where there's blue there. Year one is the first year that the project is operational. And then year 20, that's an estimate of 20 years after the project is operational. And so it's looking at the value of time and money over time. That's really what I'm trying to point out in this slide. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an example of some of the outputs that can be pulled from the CalBC model for the SB1 metrics. So the one on the far left is example outputs for change in emissions or emissions saved. That's a print screen from the model, and you can plug that right into the performance metrics form from the SB1 applications. It looks the same. And then there's the cost benefit ratio. It gives you the CalBC model gives you the total benefits, the total costs, and then the ratio. And that plugs right into the SB1 metrics form. And then for safety, it's a little more complicated, but essentially for the with and without project, you can see the difference in the rates. Without going into too much detail, the safety information is actually inputs that you have to put in there, but it will calculate the monetary value associated with the cost savings for the reduction in crashes. But those are examples of how you can use information from the model for the SB1 metrics. Next slide, please. Okay, so the thing about the model to note is that even though it's very widely used, it's required for all of our federal projects at Caltrans. It's also, we don't have a dedicated funding source to update the model, so we can only update these tools when we get funding for it through like a grant or something like that. So it's good that we are going through an update for the model right now. And some of the things that we're adding are we're adding a specific results tab. Well, we already have a results tab, but we're adding to it the SB1 metrics in a easier to use form. So right now you kind of have to know where to go in the model to get the outputs that you would use for SB1. So we're trying to make it easier for people to use for that. So we're adding a specific section where people can just go to that section and find the outputs that they need for the SB1 performance metrics easily. So we're adding that in because a lot of the smaller agencies use this model too. The ones that maybe don't have a lot of money to have a lot of different fancy tools, they will use this model because it's free and relatively it's easy to use. But we're trying to make it more user-friendly right now. The instructions are really long and dense, and it takes persistence to make it through them all. So we're trying to make the tool more user-friendly. And then we're updating the information. So we're adding some additional emissions that are found. They're not as common. They're found in MFAC, but they're not in the CalBC model right now. So we're adding a couple of those. We're adding additional economic benefits. So we're looking at the impact of a project on gross domestic product, on salaries and wages, and then we're getting into more detail on the jobs created, so direct and indirect jobs created. So those are some updates that we're making to the CalBC model tools right now. Next slide, please. And then this is my last slide, and this is just wanting to highlight the work that the economics branch does. A lot of people aren't familiar with it, but they do a lot of work for the department. They make a funding booklet every year that looks at Caltrans funding and what it goes to, the kind of money that it is, including federal, state, and local. It's really well done and also has a lot of great visualizations. Every year they do county level economic forecasts, and that data is available online for free, and you can use it to do different kinds of economic impact analyses. They do all the CalBC tools, and then they do specific ad hoc economic impact analyses for Caltrans projects. So I also put a link to the website there, and that branch chief is Gilberto Chambers. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Hannah. Next up, we will hear from Mike Wallace with Fair and Pierce. Please go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. So we could just go to the title slide of my presentation. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I wanted to follow up on Hannah's presentation on CalBC and then Matthew's overview of benefit cost analysis for SB1 and get into a little bit more on the benefits side. The costs are usually civil engineering, construction management, those types of things. So we won't talk about the cost, but I think the more important thing from most of our perspectives is the benefits, right? Making sure that we're implementing projects that are not only cost effective and beneficial, but also provide other benefits, the primary benefits, and making sure we understand what those are, and that it's not always one-to-one. That's kind of what I wanted to highlight in the presentation today, is quantifying the benefits of the project. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just kind of cover the agenda. Yeah, so we're going to talk about why, besides that it's required for a grant, why should we quantify the benefits? right? To get funding, make sure we're spending our money wisely, but what other things can it be used for? And then we'll discuss a little bit on the methods. Hannah talked about the how to quantify in CalBC, but there's things that need to occur before then, referring to some of the prior sessions that you can either go back and watch the videos or you attended. And then crucially making sure that we, capture the full, the benefit of the projects and look at the role of uncertainties and robust projects, not just given one set of numbers, since we know that the world's uncertain, making sure that we understand bringing that into our analysis. So that's kind of the agenda for this part of the presentation. Next
Excuse me,
slide.
this is the ASL interpreter. I'm not able to hear you.
Can others hear me?
You're pretty quiet, Mike.
Yeah,
Okay. Can you hear me better now?
yes.
Okay, I moved my mic closer to my face. Thank you. So on this slide, just kind of why would we do benefit cost analysis? At its core, the benefit cost analysis helps us make informed decisions about how to invest our limited transportation funds, right? There's limited funding in general, and there's a lot of competing demands on our funds. As Matthew showed, there's different funding sources for different types of projects, but still there's still limited funds, and how do we prioritize them? So doing the benefit cost analysis allows us to translate the wide range of impacts, whether that's saving lives or reducing travel time or improving air quality, into a common language, which in this case is money, right? So that everything is compared to each other. They use the benefit cost ratio to compare them. The higher the benefit cost ratio, the more economic value that project has. And like Hannah showed, it's over time, right? So what's the benefit cost over the life cycle of the project before you either need to do major reconstruction or the project reaches useful life? And it does matter the timing, right? If it takes 20 years to build the project and it only has a 5-year useful life, it probably will not have a good benefit cost ratio. So having these trade-offs, but also looking at making sure that the community's involved, right? Making sure that the projects actually benefit the community, not just that it's a great benefit cost ratio, but the community doesn't actually want this project, that they want something else. And that's where the community engagement that Matthew talked about also comes in, which is a qualitative metric, but is important to the overall analysis. So if we go to the next slide. So these are kind of, the major categories that we talked about. So the first step is to quantify, the major categories. So, the highway safety, how many reductions of collisions, the different, not just the number, but the severity, right? Ideally fewer and also less severe, less people involved, less frequent. Looking at the mobility effects, the travel time reliability, the congestion, changing of speeds, also maybe shifting to modes. There's different mobility options. Then emissions, Hannah showed that, getting the tailpipes. There's also road dust and other things that are part of the emissions. Not just global, greenhouse gases, but also local. Are they near a hospital? Are they near a school? We're getting down to the actual impact to people because of this project, not just the aggregate numbers. And then the operating cost, right? Does it take more money to ship a good? Does it take more money to drive? How does this impact your vehicle? If the roads are maintained, they're not as bumpy, there's less wear and tear on your vehicle, there's more fuel efficiency, right? So maintaining roads also impacts the cost to actually drive your vehicle and things like that. So right, quantifying what are these actual impacts before you get to even just the monetary value. So if we go to the next slide. This is, you don't need to look at the details, but you can, I'll walk you through them. But this is kind of looking at a lot of what I do as a consultant is it's hardly ever a one-to-one benefit, right? You make some kind of a project improvement that has a benefit that goes into CalBC, like reduce collisions, reduces cost of collisions. But there's also other benefits, right? So when you look at this mind map, it connects the different types of benefits. And then there's secondary and tertiary benefits, right? There's lots of things that are related to each other. So for example, when we invest in climate resiliency, we're not just protecting the infrastructure, where we're also maybe making it, the urban heat island effect is less, so that the people who live in that community pay less on their electricity bills. Similarly, when we have disadvantaged communities that are connected by transportation, it's not just giving them access to transportation, but they're also being able to get to their job or their school or their public service or their park, right? So it's not just access to the transportation, it's what are they using that transportation to access. And then also freight, right? Maybe we're investing in green freight, having freight corridors, but the benefit is not just to the freight that's traveling more efficiently. Maybe having the freight vehicles in a different corridor allows for trees and narrower streets and quality of life for the people who were in that corridor prior to the freight investment for like projects like TCEP. Also public engagement, right? The more that the public guides the process, provides their own user experience, and then there's also the increased safety. They might take transit more because they feel safe. They also have a better sense of community because they're walking around with their neighbors, they're riding their bikes, they're seeing each other on transit. They also have more confidence in the government, right? That they trust the government is listening to them, that they're using their money wisely, that their opinions matter, and that they're actually coming up with projects that are beneficial. So understanding all these interrelationships is really important, right? Some of these are quantifiable and some of them are qualitative, but understanding these benefits and highlighting them either through narrative or directly in the benefit cost. Most of this occurs prior to using CalBC. So any economic analysis tool through travel demand models or other methods, I just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of interconnected benefits that go into those primary ones that get ultimately converted into monetary. So if we go to the next slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how to actually quantify them, since a lot of these do happen prior to your economic model. So starting with the project data, looking at the travel patterns, the crashes, the demographics, remembering that this is over the course of 20 years. So it starts in a couple of years after the project is constructed, working with your original model or other sources to get how that population goes into the future. Right. So, and then also how the project changes, right? So doing a travel demand model or other analysis to say, what is the existing condition now and in the future? And if the project were implemented now and in the future, how does that change? And then measuring the impacts. The analysis tools, you had the prior workshop on travel demand models and off model tools and those different options, right? Like looking at how people might change their choice, right? Currently they drive, but they're given a great option on transit. So they shift, right? So they can read a book or rest or do their other activities without having to drive. They also don't have to maintain their vehicle, but there's all these great benefits. Active transportation, rather than driving, they're able to walk or bike safely. Right. So what are these quantifiable transportation human benefits even before we start to get to the monetization? Also the breathing less emissions. So the fewer cars on the road, if they're driving or taking or walking or taking transit, they're not producing emissions. I also wanted to highlight that the context really matters, but that these projects are occurring in a real place in a real time. So again, a lot of my job as a consultant is finding out the spreadsheet's just a mathematical equation, but it doesn't understand the context. That's up to the person doing the analysis, right? The context matters. Is it an urban setting where maybe congestion and emissions are important? Or is it a rural project where maybe safety and visibility and giving them interregional options so that they can get to their locations safely? Are those the issues, right? Keeping that in mind. Also the community that's traveling, the characteristics, like the age distribution, are they dependent on transit? How far do they have to commute? All these things are really important when doing the benefit cost analysis. It changes their behavior for one thing, then also as you start monetizing it, just keeping those things into mind. And then also as you write the narrative, right, this is part of the narrative of the project that goes behind the benefit cost analysis. And then connecting all these together, right, so that you look at the primary benefits, which are fairly obvious, right? Reduced collisions, and then the secondary benefits, right? Making sure that you quantify all those, making sure also not to count them in multiple buckets, right? They only should count once, but there's related benefits that you need to account for in tools before you get to CalBC or other tools. Just as another example, maybe having a resilient infrastructure means that you have less maintenance costs over time, or you have a detention basin that holds the water so that the road doesn't flood. Partly that is a causing delay, like Hannah was talking about, the reliability is low, but also that the cleanup crews don't have to go out there and move the trees and debris off the road because it was designed in a resilient way, right? So making sure that all these are connected before you get into the economic analysis. So then the next slide, I talked a little bit about the economic analysis. Hannah talked a lot about the CalBC model, so I won't talk about those specifically, but what I will give is some examples. So on the left-hand side are just some examples of factors, right? So that a fatality has a certain dollar value of the person's, benefit to society and their family members, and those are the things, or the lifespan that they unfortunately no longer have. Also just the time savings, right? If you're driving for personal or if you're driving for work, there's different values. If you're doing a light duty vehicle or a commercial vehicle, the operating costs are different. So they take that into account. Kind of showed a good example of the emissions cost, right? Different types of vehicles traveling different speeds have different emissions and then related costs. And then also the health costs, right? So in this example, looking at the benefits, you can see that there's the ripple effect, right? So seeing that a person who walks because the road is safer, there's a new bike lane, so they ride their bike. They also have health benefits, right? So that people who are able-bodied and able to get out there and walk or bike are able to do that. And there's pretty significant benefit for people who are having less health impacts. Right? So there's all these different types of benefits that accrue over the time. So just making sure that we reflect all of the different benefits and how they're interrelated, that nothing is one-to-one, that when you look at society, it's all interconnected. This is just kind of a visual representation of concepts of that. So I encourage people to, as they're doing their project, finding what are the downstream benefits. If you're spending money on a guardrail, what does that guardrail benefit, right? The vehicles going over the road so that the emergency vehicles don't have to go out there. It's estimated that there's about almost $11,000 every time there's a collision just for the emergency vehicles to go out there and, survey the scene, take the people to the hospital, clean it up, where that's a lot of money. And also time that police and fire could be on other calls, but they're in a collision, right? So there's downstream benefits that we need to make sure that we account for. Then if you go to the next slide. Sometimes, and I don't know if Hannah's had exact examples of this, but sometimes the numbers are negative, right? So it's not a benefit, it's a disbenefit for different metrics. So just remembering that there's trade-offs, right? There's trade-offs in pretty much everything related to transportation. So I just want to highlight some of them. Speed versus safety. The higher speeds, it does reduce travel time and it increases velocity, but it does reduce safety, right? So the higher the speeds, the more collisions there might be, but they might also be more severe, right? So this is a trade-off that we need to keep in mind. That there's different type of travelers, right? The commuters have a different value of time compared to the commercial vehicles, but also the people cutting through a community have a different value than people who live in that community, right? So there's different values and also economic values that they have. Also modal priority, right? If it's a vehicle focused project, it might make things safer and more efficient for vehicles, and people might shift out of transit. That's kind of the idea of the induced demand. If you make it faster or safer, people might shift or maybe drive at all that they had not driven in the past. But maybe a complete streets project, defocuses the auto, but focuses on other modes. But you still have that same right of way, and you have to determine how to appropriately use that. And one thing that's a little bit complicated in economic analysis is the value of time and when projects should occur, right? So the phasing of them, where like quick fix projects get out there, they start having benefit immediately, like paint on the road or cones or those types of things. Those are great, right? They do immediate benefit, but they might not last long, right? So every 5 years you might need to redo them. Every 2 years, they might not also be benefiting that many people, but they're easier to do. Which is good. But also then we'd have the long-term solutions that do take more time and also money to invest in, but they're more resilient, right? So that they last longer, they provide more benefit, but that you don't start getting your benefits until the future. And then when you do the economic component, $1 today is more valuable than $1 in the future. Right? So there's all these trade-offs of when do we need to have the safety projects versus when do we have the shifting to transit projects? Making transit projects maybe is more expensive. The safety projects might be quicker. How do you trade off these different components of your project? So then if we go to the next slide, just kind of bringing all these together, remembering that the world is uncertain. So trying to also have a robust analysis. And this is really not any part of the grant requirements. This is more of a suggestion that I have, is the world is very uncertain. One benefit cost ratio for one scenario might be 2.5, like Hannah's example. But if the world were to change or be different, it might be 0.7, right? So that's less than one. So that means it's not a robust scenario, because under one scenario it has a great economic return, benefit to the society and a good use of our money. And under another scenario, it has a poor benefit to society and a low, benefit cost and economic value. So just keeping this in mind. And so this again, just as examples, this is not the complete list. Just wanted to get people's mind thinking about this, that there's a lot of external factors like the global supply chain, health trends, regulatory changes, funding, demographic shifts, if people age in place or if they're replaced by younger people. The public might change their perception on something, right? They might say, this is really important to us. It wasn't important in the past, but we value this thing now and we had previously not. Transportation also doesn't usually impact land use and zoning, but it's influenced by it. They kind of work together. Versus there's some external factors in some ways that, I've suggested and done in my 20 years doing this, is, doing scenario planning, sensitivity analysis, saying, what happens if this changes in the future? Should we pivot? Talking to the stakeholders who, are the users of the facilities or the maintainers, those kinds of things. Looking at the monetary, is it better to do short or long term? Having pilot programs to see if it's actually useful and beneficial before making longer term investments. And then I think Matthew referred to this too when he was talking about the grant guidelines in the beginning, is make sure you get perspectives, not just transportation, but all the wide breadth of perspectives, and make sure that you at least consider these things and say, we did only one scenario, here's some of the risks, or say we did 3 scenarios, but these are not the whole complete potential universe of options. But given these 3 scenarios, they all had a positive benefit cost ratio. They might vary, or under this scenario, these were the people who had a disbenefit. What can we change in our project, or do we have another project to counterbalance that disbenefit? So with that, I think I'll stop. And then I think I had another slide just for questions, but I think Matthew, you're taking over the second half of this section. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Next, we will in fact go back to Matthew to wrap up the presentations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Grisby. So yes, we covered a lot of ground today, and as I described during my portion of this webinar, I wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit with the SB1 programs as the frame of reference. And then Hannah covered quite extensively how Caltrans contributes to project development. And then, as you heard from Mike, as a practitioner, there are several considerations that are factored into quantifying or monetizing, I should say, the benefits that we've been talking about today. So before we turn it over, I just wanted to briefly summarize the series of webinars that we've had on measuring transportation impacts. Back in March, we had our first webinar where we covered regional transportation plans and travel demand models, and we heard from a lot of our regional and metropolitan planning organization partners on how they put regional transportation plans together. During our second webinar in April, we covered tools for calculating vehicle miles traveled as required in the California Environmental Quality Act. And now in this third webinar, we're kind of closing the loop on and focusing on the performance metrics of transportation projects and the benefits of those projects as we consider and evaluate them at the Commission for transportation funding decisions. I think the last thing I wanted to emphasize today, because I did start off by talking about SB1 and accountability, is that the commission has a set of SB1 accountability and transparency guidelines, and those guidelines require that all SB1 programs and projects funded with SB1 funding have baseline agreements, which commissioners approve, and those documents memorialize the performance metrics that applicants reported, and those are what we've been talking about today. So I did want to say that at the tail end of all this, it is information that is available to the public in the form of the baseline agreement, so that we're not just asking for all of this information up front, but we are able to turn around and report out what the funding decisions are expected to deliver in terms of performance metrics and benefits to our traveling public. So I appreciate being invited to present, and Chair Grisby, I think I'm going to turn it over to you for the next phase.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to all of our presenters today. First up, we will go to public comment. So I'll pause and see if there's any public comment.
Great, thank you, Chair. Just a reminder to our attendees, you can either use the virtual hand raise option or submit your question to the Q&A tab, and that will be read on your behalf. I do see one attendee with their hand raised at this time. I'd like to call on Meenakshi Raval.
Good morning, everyone. I probably inadvertently raised my hand. I have no questions. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any other hands raised, and there have not been any questions submitted at this time.
All right, thank you so much. Therefore, we will turn to commissioners for questions or comments. First up, we will go to Commissioner Leanne Eager.
Thank you, Chair. So as we look at the different ways that different organizations can use these analysis tools, I think everyone talked about the CalBC might be the easiest for smaller organizations to use, but somebody else might use something else. Have we run into, out in the field at least, people, organizations telling us actually none of them are easy, and that different organizations, different transportation units using different kinds of analysis is actually more difficult than if we just had one that was the perfect tool that we could use? Have we heard that from people out in the field? I think I have, but I'm wondering, maybe Mike, since you're the one that might have more access to the regular folk, what have you been hearing from our partners out there in the field?
Yeah, so I'd say that it's not easy. Part of it is getting the data and understanding where to put it and how to use it. I think Hannah alluded to the extensive documentation, which is great, and also videos, which is great, right? So it's not a difficult tool to use, it's just complicated. The federal government has a spreadsheet that's kind of wide open. It's much more broad, it's much more flexible. But I think for economic analysis, you still have to know what you're doing, right? I think that's the hardest part, is the concept of what to do, which is why I wanted to highlight in my presentation the thoughtfulness that needs to go behind it. That's not just a plug in a number and get an answer. And I also don't think there is a one perfect tool, right? Because things evolve quickly.
Right.
And it made the great point about how much resources are you going to spend making the one perfect tool updated for the legislation that just passed last week, right?
Right.
So I think I'd say that things that are well defined and structured and everyone should use, like the factors that we all alluded to, those are great, right? Because then you don't have to make up your own factors. But what you do with it and how you explain your project is everything's custom. So you have things that are 80% there, and then room for flexibility. That's my suggestion. Is you can never have the perfect tool because it'll be obsolete, as soon as it's perfect.
It's true.
Also, then it would be much more complicated, right? Because you have to cover the wide range of tools, and I think CalBC is a good example. They have, I think, 5 or 6 different options to start with, and you might need to use 2 or 3 of them in combination for your project. But I think flexibility around the uniqueness of what we're trying to do, but then standardization about the dollar values, right? We don't want to argue about the dollar values of something,
Right.
because that's, anyone can just pick their own number. So we just say, this is the dollar value to use. So we're all using the same approach. We're all using the same equation. How you use this toolbox is up to you. That'd be my suggestion. But I have heard, and why, I get hired a lot, is it's not easy. Also, to be very thoughtful is not easy.
Thank you. I do appreciate you putting it into, here's why we do it. Let's start with that. Here why these different areas are important. Just one more quick question for anybody. Do we feel like those transportation agencies and those communities have had enough training on the why and how, no matter which of the models that they use?
Well, I'll go first. I don't think they have, which is also why I get hired. But I am doing training for other groups of people. One, sometimes that I've done a project before in the past and they would like to do it more on their own, but then also for organizations so that they understand the concept of what we're trying to do. But also that I think that the benefit descriptions are inherent in every project. And sometimes they just happen to be economically, benefit cost at the end, is my suggestion of, telling the public the benefits of the project, not just like your previous session on the impacts for CEQA. That's very narrow.
Right.
I would suggest that we highlight the benefits of the project and also the negatives of the project, regardless of if it's a criteria for benefit cost. But I don't think that that is very well understood, which is also probably why the different components of projects either oppose or support projects, and it's the same project, right? I think partly is we don't understand all the different perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Tiffany.
Thank you, Chair Grisby. So I have several questions. So I guess, first of all, when you're looking at all these different metrics and tools, in both quantitative and qualitative, is there ultimately a ranking then of the projects where, I mean, we have limited funds, not every project can be done, not every project cost benefit analysis says it should be done, but is there a ranking that Caltrans does that says, this project then comes in higher than the other? That's one question. And then related to that, how do you, there's all these different tools, but some of them, as you pointed out, there's some trade-offs. But for example, you've got things like travel time reliability, travel time savings. Those seem to all relate to kind of the old level of service metric. Whereas right now it seems like, and this may be changing, but there's been a very much a push with VMT being the kind of the primary metric that people are looking at because of CAPTI and SB 743. So I'm wondering, how do you weigh those different metrics to get to potentially a ranking?
I can try to answer that, and then Matthew might want to add to the CTC specific part. But the way that the CTC ranks projects is based on these metrics that we've been covering, and I'll let Matthew speak to that more. The way that Caltrans ranks projects is not using these metrics because these are the CTC's metrics for the SB1 programs, but Caltrans, if you look at it like at a really high level, has the SHOP, and that is driven by the SHOP targets that are in the SHSMP. And then it has non-SHOP. And for non-SHOP, if you're going to compete for SB1, you have to go through CSIS first. And so all the potential Caltrans projects that want to compete for SB1 are first getting vetted through CSIS. And those are a different set of metrics that Caltrans is using to prioritize the projects that we want to submit to SB1. So they go through the CSIS process first, and then they get submitted to the commission for SB1, and then they go through that ranking process. And for VMT versus, I think in terms of project impacts, that travel time savings and travel time reliability will always be important to measure. For VMT, under SB 743, you know, that's now the measure for CEQA purposes of traffic impacts for CEQA. And for SB 1, you're measuring VMT and travel time savings. So you're not necessarily prioritizing one over the other. You're looking at both when it comes to SB 1 metrics. That's really my answer, and I'll defer to Matthew on the CTC prioritization.
Yeah, no, thank you, Hannah. Commissioner Tiffany, I think what I would add from a commission staff perspective is that we covered performance metrics today, which some of them do feed into evaluation criteria for each of the SB1 programs. But each of the SB1 programs have, you know, their own objective. And I mentioned TSEP, or the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, is a freight focused program where we are primarily looking at freight benefits, you know, how much freight throughput will be traveling through the corridor once a project is built, the velocity of that freight moving through that corridor, just as an example. So what I will say is, to Hannah's point, where travel time savings and vehicle miles traveled are both considered, if you were to take a look at the SB1 guidelines and the evaluation criteria for each program, you would see how they are either mutually considered, or in the sake of quantifiable metrics versus qualitative metrics, it's a bit, it's not as plain and simple as what we covered today. There are other factors that the commission considers through evaluating SB1 programs. I don't know if I'm helping clarify or not, but
maybe Matthew, this is Tanisha Taylor, the Executive Director of the Commission. Maybe I can add and bring us out a little bit further, because when it comes to project prioritization, there is no one magic list that puts every project in a prioritization order, because there are a lot of questions that go into funding decisions. And the first question is, what is the priority for the program that you are seeking funding for? And so in one program, it may be this project. In another program, it may be this project. If we're talking about a safety improvement, we are gonna, to Mike Wallace's point, there are trade-offs. We're gonna prioritize safety as king. If people are dying on the roadway, we may sacrifice some other things for safety. And so it's really goes to the purpose and need, the funding sources, and even beyond SB1, this is across all of transportation. Because if we're talking about a program that's a Federal Transit Administration program, we're going to put a different project forward than if we're talking about a different program that's focused on something else. And so it's going to be this combination of what's the program asking, what are the priorities, and we've seen this with every administration, that every administration kind of carves out, here's my priority, here are the things that I want to focus on, here's how I want to achieve the things that I'm doing at the federal, the state, and the local level. And those are how we do some of the decisions. Some of the decisions are purely, this is what's needed. So that's part of the regional transportation planning process that we talked about earlier, where we get into the plan and then we look at the environmental and all of these impacts. And so I think Mike Wallace's presentation really kind of summarized that there is this discussion of trade-offs and limited funding, and what can that funding be used for, that drives kind of how we prioritize projects, and the list changes over time, depending on how much money we have, what the requirements are for the different fund sources, and what's the most urgent need, because the demographics, to Mike Wallace's point, and the challenges that we're trying to solve change over time as well.
Well, and that kind of feeds into the last question I was going to ask Tanisha, which is, so as the budgets get tightened up and as statewide, and then as potentially there's reduced federal funding that comes our way because of the current administration, am I right in thinking that may then change some of the priorities and how we address different projects, because we know we have limited funds, and you know, we're dealing with the fires in LA and all the ramifications of that. I mean, that's all part of the mix, I gather, as we are evaluating projects.
That is all part of the mix, is that oftentimes you may hear this kind of false concept that things are static and that we have projects that are 30 years old and they never get reevaluated to see if they are still a priority. Projects are frequently reevaluated to see if they are still a priority, to see if they still rise to the top of our funding needs. And so we're constantly looking at those things. I think you see it when we talk about and like in a real world example at the commission meeting, when we up that emergency reservation. The emergency reservation is saying we have more emergency needs than we thought we might. We need to take that money, right? Because the zero sum game, that emergency money comes from somewhere. So we're making a decision on projects that to say we're gonna deal with the fires in LA, or we're gonna deal with the fires wherever they may be, or we're gonna deal with snowstorms or whatever the challenges may be at the time. And there are other projects that won't be done because we need that money for that. Now, that gets reshuffled every year. It gets reshuffled every 4 years, every 5 years. There is a lot of reshuffling that happens based on what's going on in the real world.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other commissioner questions? Vice Chair Falcon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Matthew, Hannah, and Mike for your presentations. Really thought-provoking. I'm just kind of thinking because Commissioner Tiffany actually asked a couple of the questions that I wanted to ask, particularly as it relates to federal funding and prioritization. But, I'm just thinking about the effort that it puts, it takes to identify the need for the projects, and then, and then to develop the projects, prioritize the projects per region, really elevates the importance, both of the quantitative and qualitative lenses by which you all run these projects through. Something that Mike said kind of got me thinking about efficacy of projects over time, as we've been talking about trade-offs. People change their travel patterns, maybe different modes of transportation that folks start to think and choose, changing political winds, and just changing land use and developments over time. And it just got me thinking about, with all these models and tools that we use, how often, and I don't know if this is the right question to ask, but I'll ask it anyway, how often are projects run through these tools and models? And again, it's from just kind of thinking about how we're prioritizing projects, how long it takes to get projects from, thought to construction. How are we using these at the right time, the right ways through sort of the project selection and beyond? Did I stump you all?
No, maybe Mike, can you take that one?
Yeah. So you learned about RTPs and other regional plans in the past. So luckily there's a 4-year cycle of seeing our things different. Luckily with the pandemic and the economic bubble that happened in 2008 and other things, people are kind of realizing that the future is uncertain. They're also looking at autonomous vehicles, advanced air mobility, all these different uncertainties. So the nice thing about these requirements is that every 4 years, in general, plans are reevaluated, land use patterns are reevaluated. Is the population of your area going up or down? What are the demographic changes? So every 4 years, the major plans are reevaluated, at least the original scales. The cities are also, kind of required, but they get a little bit of leeway on updating their general plans and other local plans. So I think periodically, kind of like Tanisha alluded to, it's kind of cyclical. Every 4 to 6 years, there's a reevaluation. How much every project is reevaluated, it really determines time, but also, like you said, it's politics. But also there's certain community members or certain parts of the community that benefit from certain projects. You can't have all the projects in one region when you're a regional agency. Right? So there's all these trade-offs that even the agency goes through. But I'd say that every 2, 4, 6, 8 years, there's opportunities to reevaluate, and that's where the public feedback is important. I think that the public should be asked questions like, not just do you like this project or not, but how has your life changed since the last time we talked to you? Right? There's been a pandemic, there's been a economic recession. Did your kids go to college and now you want to downsize? Right? What's changing in your life that the transportation system should accommodate? Like, are you willing to take advanced aerial mobility? Right? Getting feedback from the public, I think, helps you identify what projects might need to be reevaluated. If a certain project still benefits a lot of people, maybe don't reevaluate it. If a certain project is very expensive and only benefited one community, maybe that's the one that you reevaluate. Maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that you get rid of it, because that might be the lifeline to that community. But at least you say, let's confirm that this is still true, that the people who it benefited would still benefit from it. Right? That, I think where the qualitative part of this is so important, that we understand, is this even the right project that helps meet your needs, or should we value engineer this project or change the project before we even go through this detail? That's my opinion, but it does take time and money, right? And this is also the challenge of just doing the planning is not inexpensive.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Mike.
Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners? I have a few. First one, we know that equity is very important to the commission, and one of the major planks of equity is public participation in the process and public engagement and touch points. One of the major issues is that there's asymmetries of information at the local level. Oftentimes for smaller community groups or organizations or even groups of neighbors who get together. And I'm wondering what how has the Academy changed over time when it comes to providing online tools, basic online tools for community members to understand the differences between the economic impacts of various projects. And this comes to mind for me because I know that pre-pandemic, some of the national trade associations in our industry had developed some back of the envelope online tools for their membership. And I'm wondering if those have made their way out to the general population in various ways that will allow someone to understand from a back of the envelope online tool what the economic impact would be from various projects that their local government is considering, long before that the chosen project comes to the state for funding.
Mike, I think that might be you again.
So it depends a lot on the organization, right? So every agency, I think, interacts with the public differently. So that's a hard question, like especially to generalize, but I'd say that I think we could do better in general, but especially value engineering the project, right? To say, if we change the project components, who would benefit from it?
Are you speaking into the microphone?
Oh, sorry, was it too quiet again?
Yes.
Okay. So the general answer is, I think it depends on the project or the agency or both, and also timing. There's a lot of different things. The educational components that you talked about, I don't think there is a lot other than, they're made aware of public meetings. They could read about regional transportation plans. So, Matthew or others might have more insight into what educational information is available to the public. I haven't seen very many good tools that simplify the trade-offs, but I have seen during an individual project, when you're getting public feedback that is part of the project, right? You have certain funds available. If you allocate your tokens or dollars, or you name your method of kind of gamification, if you allocate it to this, like all bikes, your transit system breaks down or your roads break down because you didn't resurface them, right? So I think it's part of in part of the public engagement is the financial component of, we don't have unlimited resources. There's different trade-offs. They help different people. How do you spend them? But I haven't seen outside of that like an educational component, other than like, project by project. But maybe others on the panel have.
Chair Grisby, I think your question started from how how are those in communities that will be impacted by transportation projects be made aware of what's even in the works for a plan? And I would like to bring it back to the commission in terms of our programming team, where we're looking at these projects that have been in the works for several years. So my perspective is really kind of on that end stage, but what I can say from the SB1 programming perspective at the commission is we understood early on through our second cycle that we needed to ask more detail of applicants to describe how they engaged their communities, what types of practices that they were performing. And all this to say, it became an evaluated criteria. Community engagement became an evaluated criteria in our third cycle. And a lot of the feedback that we got from applicants was, you know, this is something we've always done. However, because it's now being evaluated and we incorporated it's referred to as the transportation equity supplement to the SB1 programs that kind of describes at a very high level what some potential best practices would be in this area. We have come a long way since cycle 3, and I know we haven't gotten to the June commission meeting where we'll be proposing cycle 4, but I think at this point I can say, even by requiring through an evaluated criteria more of potential project applicants at the funding determination stage, we're seeing a lot more, I would say, results in a positive sense from what our local, regional, and even large regional applicants are putting together in this area. So I can say, I think because we now evaluate it, it's being considered, and we expect it to improve over time, because as you heard Mike say, this is putting a project together is a time-consuming process, and I think we're getting caught up where it's now at the forefront. And I'm not suggesting it was never at the forefront, but when it rolls up to state funding decisions, it's now a very strong evaluated consideration. So all that to say, I think from my perspective, projects are improving in this area, but I obviously don't have the expertise at the level that I think Mike does. And I don't know if Hannah has anything to add, but I understand Caltrans is also making it a priority over the last several years as well.
Any other panel members that would like to answer that question or engage?
I'll
All right,
just, or
please
go
go
ahead, Mike. Oh, sorry, Chair Christie. I'll just add that at Caltrans, I know that one thing we've really been doing to try to improve equity is through our public engagement portal. So we've put a lot of time and work into that, and essentially it's a platform and a series of tools to try to help districts have the tools that they need to engage early and engage well with communities impacted by transportation projects that are in the planning phases. And so we're trying to improve our engagement early on and really think through how we can best engage with communities through that work. And then the equity index is the other way. So.
Thank you. And I have one more question, which is, we know that there are various ways to measure the outcomes of projects. That's been made very clear throughout our webinar series. One of the questions I have is if there's any ability or any track record that people know about of taking what usually is kind of complicated jargon that the average person may not understand that comes from a TREDA's output or whatever, as it relates to out-of-pocket expenses. Like there are a couple that I mentioned earlier that could be monetized. And I'm wondering, has anyone started to package that into Project A saves the working class $500 over time? versus project B saves X. Have we gotten to that point for elected officials and the public to understand the economic implications of the various project choices to the average person?
Yeah, so whenever, I'm mostly focused on the benefit cost analysis. So I do write the memo that goes along with it, but I do provide content to the overall narrative of the application. Ideally, the overall project, not just the benefit cost. And I do always put it in terms of that, right? Actually, I've started to develop tables and summaries up at the top that say, here's the project's, here's the community's concern, here's the project feature, and here's the outcome of that project feature. So I do try to get it down to that language, right? How much money is saved per year, per person, and how much money over the life cycle of this project is saved per person. It's on average, still caveats, but I do try to bring it down to the person level, because I think if we can bring it down to the person level, and it's understandable to the public, the people reviewing the application for the grant understand the project. If you don't communicate it the right way, they don't understand your project, they don't live in that community. And in my perspective, you're already at a disadvantage when you're trying to compete because they don't understand what your benefits are. So I personally always try to do that, but I think it's rare because when you look at the benefit cost requirements, there's nothing about the actual people at all. And I think that that's, why I also have these presentations that I try to remember these are for the public. This is not just to get a good benefit cost analysis ratio. So that's, it is done, but seldom.
All right, thank you, Mike. And we'll make that our last comment in order to wrap this up. During this webinar series, we've discussed key quantitative tools used to understand transportation project impacts and benefits. As the Commission considers projects for funding and approval, we've appreciated hearing from program and project level practitioners about the technical inputs and outputs essential in identifying and supporting transportation improvements. We also welcome the continual improvement of these tools as we look to meet various state goals. With that, we thank all of those who participated today and throughout this webinar series, including our speakers, commissioners in attendance, and those of the public. We are now adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, team. Great job.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Hey, Tanisha,
Yes.
signaling an email I forwarded to you from a well-meaning county supervisor in Santa Cruz County in your crazy life. If and when you or Paul can take a peek at that, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely.
He wants to step into very dangerous territory, converting a current lane into a hot lane, as you'll see on Highway 17.
I did skim it, so I'm gonna find some references to highlight the areas where he will enter and the response they may receive.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate
Yes,
it.
of course. Thanks,
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.